What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Geek Pantheon. I am Eric, and today I wanted to talk to you all about villains, and specifically a tabletop role-playing game system that I've come across that I think does villains better than 90% of tabletop role-playing games out there, including the most popular ones. So this is Fabula Ultima, which is a tabletop role-playing game based around Japanese RPG video games and anime as well. And initially, I didn't check this out when I first saw it coming across my radar because, being perfectly honest, I've never really gotten into anime or JRPGs. And so I thought this system wasn't for me. And boy, was I incorrect in that assumption, because there are so many systems and mechanics in this game that are phenomenal, but above all else, in my opinion, is how they handle villains. And I think that this system can be transplanted from Fabula Ultima into virtually any tabletop role-playing game system out there. The only thing you need to make this system work is some kind of resource that the players have to initiate rerolls. Things like hero points in Pathfinder or inspiration in D&D, bennies in Savage Worlds. All of those mechanics can make this villain system work really well. So I'm going to go over how the villain system works, and then you can decide if you want to take it to your next game session, campaign, session 0, whatever, and pitch it to the rest of your table. So like I said, you need some kind of resource that the players have access to initiate rerolls, and or some other beneficial mechanic on their end. So the way villains work is villains are like any other enemy monster, except they have their own pool of this resource. In Fabula Ultima, players have Fabula points, villains have Ultima points. And they function a little bit differently, but functionally they're very similar, except in one major way. Players can obviously always earn more Fabula points or bennies, inspiration, hero points. The villains have a fixed amount based on the level of villain that they are. So you have 3 levels of villains: minor, major, and supreme, and they get 5, 10, or 15 points. And they can use these to initiate a reroll. They can recover whatever kind of systems you have to show how weakened a villain is. In Fabula Ultima, you get to remove all current statuses and regain 50 mind points, which is the mental health / how you cast magic and things like that in the system, or use your skills in general. So it allows them to get back up into the fight. But what makes the villain system really interesting is, firstly, players earn a Fabula point, or whatever you're using for your system, anytime a villain shows up. So anytime a villain walks into the room, they immediately gain a point to presumably use against the villain in some way. Now, this can either be face-to-face with the villains, or what Fabula Ultima encourages GMs to do is have villain scenes, third-person cutaway scenes that show the villain what they're up to, conversations they're having, things that are going on when the player characters aren't around, which I love. The system says to do this fairly frequently, like not to just have it be a once every now and then thing. Let the players be aware of what the villains are up to. Obviously, the characters won't know, but the players will, and that can be really fun and engaging. Now, where the mechanics come in is, obviously, villains have their own pool of Ultima points that do not regenerate. There is no way for a villain to gain more Ultima points, with one very notable exception. Now, first and foremost, when a villain reaches 0 hit points, if they have an Ultima point left, they can spend an Ultima point to escape. So this is such a phenomenal tool for game masters who perhaps a combat encounter that you thought was going to go one way isn't going the way that you thought it was, and you have a potentially big bad villain that you're not ready to fall into the player's hands or to get killed or something like that. Obviously, there's a lot of advice out there of like engineer and escape, but if you have introduced this system to your players at session 0 and they know that this is a possibility, then it's going to feel less cheap when you spend a point to say the villain makes a dramatic escape. The example it gives in the book is you're fighting a pirate queen on the deck of her ship, and you have her cornered. She is at 0 hit points, and the GM spends an Ultima point. They step off the deck, and as the player characters look over the edge, a dragon has flown by and caught them as they fly off with a one-liner shaking their fist back at the player characters. and they live to fight another day. That is one way to use Ultima points. And like I said, for a minor villain, you only have 5 Ultima points. So if you spent a couple on rerolls, you're only going to be able to do that so many times before they run out. Now, I will say a big thing with this system is if your table, you're super crunchy, you love the war game aspect of tabletop role-playing games, you love the math, and you think that the ideal version of a tabletop role-playing game is all things being equal, it just coming down to the dice, and there's no wiggle room outside of what the rules state, then this system might not sound that compelling to you because you've earned the 0 hit points that villain is at. It feels cheap for them to get to arbitrarily escape. Me personally, I tend to err more towards the narrative side of gaming. And so I think this is a really fun and engaging, and even as a player, I would think it's fun because I know they have a limited resource. This is a thing they can do only so many times before we're finally going to have them cornered, and they either have to surrender or they die or something like that. Now, the last component of this system that I absolutely adore from a narrative standpoint and a mechanical standpoint, because these are mechanics that we're applying to how we handle villains in our story, is escalations. So like I said, there are 3 versions of a villain: minor, major, and supreme. Minor have 5 Ultima points, major have 10, supreme have 15. And as we've already talked about, if they reach 0 hit points and they still have an Ultima point left, they can use that to escape the current encounter and live to fight another day. But if a villain reaches 0 hit points and has no Ultima points left, they have the opportunity in the Fabula Ultima system to surrender. And narratively, it's really interesting for a villain to then become an ally because they've been bested by the player characters. They see eye to eye now, they've gained each other's respect, yada yada. But there is also a version of that where the option to surrender isn't met that way. It isn't met positively, and in fact is a rather negative thing that can occur. And what happens here in the system is an escalation. So when a villain has 0 hit points left and 0 Ultima points, you have the option as the GM to initiate an escalation. Now, the book does say, importantly, this should only happen 2 to 3 times max over the course of an entire campaign. So this is a very rare occurrence and should be reserved for those truly epic villains that you want to stick around over the course of the campaign. So basically what happens is when a minor villain has 0 Ultima points, hit 0 hit points, you can choose for them to reject the option to surrender or the option to die or whatever. And they escalate into a major villain. But there should be some big narrative and mechanical reflections of this. They should become a more sinister villain. Their motive should become darker. They should be more powerful. And this can manifest either supernaturally or just in their motivation. And you can see a villain progress further and further down the road of darkness over the course of a campaign through escalations. And you could have a minor villain that starts off as just the lieutenant of a bandit camp, and by the end of the campaign, they've escalated into a supreme villain that is one of the big bads of the campaign. Now, importantly, when you escalate, they become a brand new villain functionally, which means they have a whole new pool of Ultima points. So they go from max 5, they've used all of them, to now they have 10 brand new Ultima points. This is the only way villains can replenish their Ultima point pool. And even so, they're not really doing that because you are effectively creating a whole new villain just with the same name and baggage as the previous villain. And I love the storytelling implications of this because you can have a villain go descend further and further down, ultimately to then be redeemed. You could have somebody that maybe is just a rival of the party as a minor villain, but then they take the loss to the heroes poorly and they escalate into a major villain that aligns themselves with the big bad of the campaign. And it's not until the players have finally bested them once they are a major villain and they have the option to surrender that they finally take it because they realize the error of their ways and what they've done. And there's so many narrative things you can do with the mechanics here. And it's all supported in the mechanics, so it doesn't feel cheap or like you are just hand waving or using plot armor to keep this villain alive. You present the mechanics to your table and say, here are some rules that I would like to implement for villains. And then the players know these are possibilities, these are things that can happen, which I love. What do you all think? Do you think this is an interesting system? Are you interested to try it out? Definitely check out Fabula Ultima. And if you want a full review of that system, let me know down in the comments below, and I'll consider doing a full review of that tabletop role-playing game system soon. Thank you all so much for watching. I've been Eric, and I will see you next time.